Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for August 28th, 2023. In a rapidly changing world, I want to give you some updates on events that occurred over the weekend which you probably aren't aware of. But let me start by giving a belated birthday greeting to Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Helga, happy birthday and wishes for many, many more to come. Now, let's move on to the BRICS, which is not an unrelated subject for Helga because she has been very instrumental in making the effort to allow you to know something about what's going on internationally when the media and the corporate oligarchy is trying to hide this from you. But over the last week at the BRICS conference in South Africa, momentous developments occurred, including total refutation of the line that was coming out from governments and the media that it would be a failure, there wouldn't be agreement, that it's not so significant, and so on. Well, what happened is they added 6 nations to the existing total of 5. These included Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Argentina. These developments were met with either silence, slanders, or lies in the Western media. No surprise, of course, because this overturns the existing unipolar order by showing that the nations of the Global South will no longer submit to neocolonial policies. Now, they're missing the biggest story in the media on purpose. The question I have is kissing the ass of the military-industrial complex and the corporate cartels the only thing taught in journalism schools today? Now let's take a look at what this addition to the BRICS means. Remember, the BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, with 6 new nations added. These 11 countries have a total gross domestic product of $59.8 trillion. Compared to the G7, the total GDP is $48.5 trillion. So it's nearly 11 trillion, more than 11 trillion larger GDP. The total debt, the BRICS countries have a total debt of $8.9 trillion. The G7 countries have a total debt of $55.5 trillion. So which alliance is more solvent? Now, additionally, the BRICS now have over half the world's proven oil reserves. Now, the other development from the BRICS conference was the consolidation of the new development bank of the BRICS, headed by former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. They made a commitment to increasing their capability to make loans for developing countries. And the idea is that the bank will be run by and for developing countries outside of the control of the City of London and Wall Street. They're going to increase the use of national currencies for trade and investment. And investment will be directed especially towards infrastructure and modernization of infrastructure, especially in Africa. Now, Biden, Blinken, and the others can sneer and attempt to denigrate this development, but they can't stop it unless they're willing to extend the number of wars, regime change operations, and destabilizations. And if they try to do that, you might ask them, how is the Ukrainian counteroffensive going? Do you really think you can afford more wars and the danger of becoming more isolated from the rest of the world? Now, the second thing that occurred over the last days is quite interesting in itself, but in this context of the upcoming presidential election, the tectonic shift in world events with the establishment of the BRICS, you have the case developing against Joe Biden, the U.S. president. Now, there were comments made by former Russian President Medvedev, which are quite interesting. Here's what he said, quote, "Biden has long become Ukraine's hostage due to his deep involvement in Ukraine." Of course, unquote, this is a reference to Biden's role in the 2014 Maidan coup that brought the current government into power, and his commitment to the war against Russia being funded and armed by NATO and especially by the US. Medvedev went on to say, quote, "He is involved there mentally, politically, and economically, which besides his intellectual abilities, has tied his hands entirely," unquote. He went on to say, "This is sad for the US and for Ukraine, that the US is sending huge numbers of soldiers to certain death." Medvedev concluded by saying that the only reason for this is, quote, "the Biden family's deepest involvement in Ukrainian schemes," unquote. This, of course, is a reference to the fact that the Biden family was directly connected to Ukraine through Biden's son, Hunter Biden's involvement with Burisma, an oil company. And this is something which is back in the news again. But let me simply add that I don't agree with Medvedev that this is the only reason for Biden's problems and for the Ukrainian schemes. It's also related to the BRICS, the development of the BRICS and the attempt to weaken Russia. But the Biden corruption is certainly a factor, and this emerged again over the weekend in an interview given by the former Ukrainian prosecutor Viktor Shokin. Biden bragged in a January 2018 television interview with the Council on Foreign Relations that Shokin was fired after he threatened to withhold U.S. aid from the Obama-Biden administration unless Shokin were fired. Shokin said of this, "It is his, quote, personal conviction that yes, this was the case. They, the Biden family, were being bribed," unquote, referring to the Burisma payments to Hunter Biden. And Shokin asked the question, "Isn't that alone a case of corruption?" unquote. Well, it is, and it's now being investigated by the Congress. The media is dragging its feet. You remember this was an issue in the 2020 campaign when Twitter came out and suppressed the story of the Hunter Biden laptop. 51 former top U.S. intelligence officials came out and said, this is Russian disinformation. Well, now it's obviously the case. It's not Russian disinformation. It's true. And the question of whether Biden is legitimately committed to, quote, Ukraine's freedom and democracy, unquote, or rather to cover up his own corruption, that's a question that the Congress and the American voters will have to take up. Now, the third story I want to mention is the death of the head of the Wagner PMC, Yevgeny Prigozhin, where the universal story in the West is this was a Putin hit. Biden implied it, saying nothing happens in Russia without Putin's involvement. U.S. intelligence initially said there was anti-aircraft fire that brought down the plane. They were forced to come out and admit that there was no evidence of that. That was just a made-up story. But this is typical of the anti-Putin playbook. Anything that happens can be spun as to show that Putin, as a tyrant and a dictator, is a bloodthirsty killer. Now, there's much more to the story of this, because Wagner not only was involved in crucial battles in Ukraine around the city of Bakhmut in particular, but Wagner is playing a crucial role in defending African nations from so-called Islamic terrorist groups. And the Wagner role in Africa has been critical. And we see it now coming to a head where the anti-French sentiment in French West Africa has emerged, with the latest being the coup in Niger, the threats to send in military forces to overturn the coup. Well, the coup is an expression of Nigerians' military rejecting the role of the West in its so-called counter-terror efforts. And not only that, but it's unfair trade practices, it's looting, it's predatory looting of the resources of Niger. And this is, again, a part of the story of what's going on with the BRICS, why the global South is moving against the global North. But promoting the anti-Putin lie, and this is, I think, really indicative, is the lying former Prime Minister of Great Britain, Boris Johnson. Johnson called Prigozhin's death, quote, a violent liquidation, unquote. adding, quote, "I cannot think of another example of such ostentatious and uninhibited savagery by a world leader," unquote. Well, first of all, he's saying this with no evidence of any involvement of Putin or the Russian state. But obviously, he's forgotten the routine practice of assassinations carried out by British special forces and other countries' special forces trained by the British, particularly in Africa, where there's a whole history of assassinations of leaders who oppose the colonial policies of the European powers. Now, you can check out a report on this by the UK column's Mike Robinson, who spoke at our Saturday Manhattan Project meeting, and it's linked below, beginning at 36 minutes in the tape. So here we are in a situation where we face the potential for a new beginning of mankind based on cooperation, not based on geopolitical division. And the problem is you're not being told about it. So help us get the story out. Circulate the appeal from Helga Zepp-LaRouche that the global north must join with the BRICS, and keep pushing the truth. Regardless of whether your friends agree or not, sooner or later the truth will come out, and you can play a role in making sure that that happens sooner. So thanks for joining me today. I'll be back again with you tomorrow.